So what effect do hills have on the range of an EV? Well, we have here a Hyundai Kona, we have a BYD Atto 3 and a Tesla 3, and we're going to find out and in the process bust a popular misconception about EV range and hills. And it's also going to be interesting to see how much energy each of these three cars will use across our test loop.
So this is our test protocol. We got the three cars, the Kona, Tesla and the Atto 3. They're going to drive in convoy, so the same speed and the same conditions. We're going to note the range prediction, the battery state of charge and the kilowatt hours used. And all three cars have pretty much the same size battery around about the 60 kilowatt hour mark. And here's our route. So we start off from a place called Narbethong, and we've got a fairly flat 26 kilometre run up to Buxton, and then we stop at a place called Marysville, and that's the end of the flat section. Then we've got the hill climb, and that's 21 kilometres up a hill, and you can see that the line is moving a lot slower now. That's because the average speed has significantly dropped, and that's going to become a bit interesting later on. So we drive the car all the way to the top, that's at 21 kilometres, and then back down we go, back down to Marysville, ending at our start point. Now we should note the Kona had these roof rails which we didn't take off. That would have had a small effect on its consumption, but we didn't measure that. So each of the times we stopped, we carefully noted down and took photographs of all of the car's displays, but when I came to do the numbers, I found there was a bit of a problem.
The BYD Atto 3 gives us an example of what I'm talking about. This graph here shows the average electricity consumption over time, and then we've got an average here represented by that line, and that line doesn't seem too far out at minus 1.7. Here it's 9.6. Does seem like it should be a little bit higher, but maybe not a million miles out. This is 11.2, and there's significantly more on top of that trend line, and it is underneath it. So again, I think that either that figures out, or this line's out, or something is out there. It just doesn't quite stack up. And it kind of was really brought home when we drove from Marysville to Lake Mountain up a hill. Now, the average consumption there was, according to the trip meter, 17.5. Now, that was about half what the Tesla and the Kona used. But if we look at it this way, we say, okay, use 11% of battery, that's about 6.6 kilowatt hours, 21 kilometres travelled, so that's about 31 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometres. That's about line ball with the Tesla and the Kona, which both recorded 35, yet the BYD was reporting about 17.5. Now, I did email BYD about this. I did not get a response, so we'll just have to pretty much ignore those figures, unfortunately, and work off percentage of battery and distance travelled. So let's look at the three car average results then. So we're going to take all the figures from all three cars, and then that will give us an idea of what's happening. So on the first flat section, they use 12 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometres as an average for each. Uphill, that more than doubled to 29, and then downhill, they added on average 4 kilowatt hours per 100 kilometres. So in terms of battery use, that was 0.26% per battery. Remember, the batteries aren't exactly the same size, but they're fairly close, around the 64 kilowatt hour mark. 0.6 battery, and then they added 0.15 battery percent per kilometre. So the thing about the battery percent is it's not actually 100% reliable either, because the percentage charge of a battery is in fact a calculation. There's an algorithm. That's one problem with it. The second problem with it is that it's not very granular, because you can drive for a fair bit before it goes from, let's say, 88% to 87%, and you'd really want sort of 0.1 of a battery or something like that, so you can't get it. So it's not ideal to go off battery percent, but when you don't have any other numbers to go on, it's what you have to do, and it's also a good sanity check against some of the other figures that you see recorded. So now let's compare the hill climb and descent with running on the flat. Now, taking all three cars as an average, they lost 13% of battery going uphill and added 3% going downhill, and that's a usage of net 5.25 kilowatt hours and lost 10%. Now, that's 42 kilometres. If we take the flat running and we extrapolate that out, then we find that we actually use 11% of battery on the flat and 5.24. So near enough, that's actually identical. Now, at this point, you're probably thinking one of two things. You're going, yep, I knew it. Hills probably improve range, or at least they don't make a difference to it. Or maybe you're coming from an engineering and physics background and you're screaming at me going, you must have made a mistake, you've got something wrong, etc. Well, I haven't made a mistake with the calculations, but what I have done is omitted something, and it is this: speed. Now, on the hill, we had an average speed of 47 kilometres an hour, and that's the speed traced from the GPS receiver. On the flat, the average was 82 kilometres an hour, so that's quite significantly different. Now, there's a lot of ups and downs here. The GPS receiver tends to bounce around a bit, but the average speed would work out to be accurate. Now, that is a very significant difference, and it has a huge effect on range, because if we look at this, this is a graph showing the speed from 10 to 110 kilometres an hour of the consumption, electrical consumption of a Hyundai Kona EV. And I think that's pretty representative of most of them. And what we find is that around 50 kilometres an hour compared to 80 kilometres an hour, there's 45% greater consumption. Now, the reason this is important is because aerodynamics are the biggest source of energy use or drag once you get probably above, I don't know, 30, 40 k's an hour, and it just increases beyond that. And there's something called the speed squared law. So if you double your speed, you get 4 times the drag. If you triple your speed, it's 9 times the drag. And if you quadruple your speed, it's 16 times the drag. And that is why these graphs go up so quickly, because once you start to get into higher speeds, that extra 10% of speed has more than 10% of drag, and drag's really the main factor once you get into cruising speed with EVs, which is why EVs are so focused on aerodynamic efficiency, and it's also the key to why they have such a big impact on range when towing. I've gone into that in more detail in another video. So that's 45% greater here. Now, if we go back to that original set of results, and what we do is we say, okay, we're going to take the original 21 k's up, 21 k's down, we'll leave that as is, but we're going to take 40% off the figure for the flat running. Then we actually come up to 7% of battery used and 3.3 kilowatt hours. So the conclusion from that is exactly what everyone with an engineering and physics sort of background knew right from the start, which is that hills actually do decrease your range relative to running on the flat. There's absolutely no question about that, but there's good reasons why you might think otherwise.
So let's take a look at that in more detail. Now we're going to take the figures for the 3 cars average. So at the start of the trip, they were reading an average of 407 kilometres in range. Then we drove 26 kilometres, remember that's pretty much on the flat for our first segment, and predicted range dropped across the 3 of them to 373 kilometres, but the total range was 399. Now I get the total range by adding the 373 to the 26, so that's how far we've travelled since we began measuring, plus the prediction. Now, what we then did was drove to the top of the hill, and this is where things started to get interesting, because you can see that there's a big drop of the predicted range from 373 down to 310. That's over 60 kilometres, yet we'd only driven 21 kilometres. And why was that? That's because the car is using its recent history to figure out what your consumption is like. Now in this case it's pretty much on the flat, so that would have taken into account relatively flat, albeit fairly high speed running, and over here we'd have used a lot of energy climbing up those hills, as you saw, and it would have factored that in. Now the extent to which it factors in maybe just the hill climb or that or whatever else, we don't know. I mean, that's proprietary information specific to each manufacturer, but definitely 21 k's of hill climb had an effect, but the effect we can't say. Now coming down the hill we find the reverse effect. Have a look at this. So we've gone 373, a drop to 310, but this has actually gone up from 310 to 338 because the car has now basically added energy to its battery, so the battery's got a greater state of charge at the bottom of the hill than at the top of the hill, and the car recognises that. However, it doesn't get super optimistic. It just goes, all right, maybe I can get back to what I originally was before, which is pretty much what it's done. 406 kilometres, the total range, which again is the total distance we've driven plus the predicted so far. And then at the end here, we drive for another 26 kilometres back pretty much on the flat, and we come out with a total range pretty close to what we saw in the beginning. And the interesting thing here is that how the algorithm errs on the side of safety. So driving up the hill, we saw this huge drop in range, and I think that's good because from a safety perspective, if you're going to keep driving up a hill, you've got to tell the driver that the range is decreasing. But coming down the other side, we didn't see such a corresponding increase in range. You know, the range didn't go from 310 to 370 or something like that. So I think that's quite a good safety factor. So it kind of just goes to show how complicated range calculations are in EVs. Now what I've done here is I've graphed a predicted range for each of those vehicles on each stage, and they all started with a different state of charge and therefore a different range, and you can see that they're all fairly consistent. As you drive, the predicted range gets lower, so we've driven to 26 k's here. Obviously it's lower at that point. The uphill, they all took a steep dive. You can see the way that line starts to get a little bit steeper now, decreasing the range and reflecting the increased energy consumption. And coming uphill it goes coming downhill it goes the other way, and on the flat it goes back down again. And if I plot them all from the same point over here, it's interesting to see that the BYD is both more optimistic and more pessimistic than the other two, because it started to drop its range relatively quickly here. When we went up the hill, it really reduced its expected range a lot more, or the predicted range, and that's not the same as its actual range. I mean, who knows what its actual range can be? This is the predicted range, not the actual range. And then coming down the hill, the BYD was like, okay, down the hill, yeah, you're going to get a lot more now. So basically from that, it's saying that the BYD of these three is the one which will vary its range the most, whereas the other two are a little bit closer together and less likely to vary it. But looks like they all came out to pretty much the same place in the end.
Now, one other interesting point is this particular truck here, and that actually has a really clever system where it looks like a perpetual energy machine, but it's not really. So what happens is that at the top of a hill, that truck is loaded with 65 tons of rock, and it comes down the hill. When it comes down the hill, it uses regen to charge its battery. And the more weight you have in a vehicle when you're coming down the hill, then the more regen you're going to get and the more energy is going to be pumped into that battery. Now when it's at the bottom of the hill, it then dumps its load, and then it's very, very light, 65 tons lighter. It can then use the energy it gained coming down the hill to drive up to the top of the hill. But that only works because it's taking a very heavy load from the top of the hill to the bottom of the hill, and obviously that won't work for you as a recreational driver unless you've got an incredibly heavy load of people at the top, towing a trailer or whatever else, and then you dump all at the bottom and then you drive up, and even then it'll probably be a bit of a stretch. But that's why that works, and that saves 50,000 litres of diesel a day, and it can actually generate enough excess energy to start pumping back into the grid or whatever the mining operation is.
So let's take a look at some of the factors which go into calculating your electric vehicle's range, and it is a very complex algorithm indeed. We're going to start with environmental. And that obviously starts with temperature, because a battery needs to be at a certain temperature to form at its best. Above that, it's going to be too hot. Below that, it's going to be too cold. And that's why modern EVs have battery management systems which will actually use some of the battery's temperature to bring it up to that ideal temperature range. And you often see vents in the front of vehicles which will open to try and cool the battery down if it's got too hot. Night and day makes a difference as well, not just in terms of temperature, but at night you can expect different pressures, and also the usage cycle will start to vary as well. You start to use headlights and things like that as well, which increases energy consumption. Rain, that actually affects consumption as well. Not only do you typically have the wipers going, but also the mere act of driving through water is more rolling resistance than it is not driving through water. That spray being throwing up requires energy. That energy ultimately comes from the battery. Wind, huge factor. Obviously a tailwind and a headwind, but also a side wind can make a massive difference to an EV, because EVs are very, very aerodynamically sensitive. That's why so much effort goes into making them streamlined. Humidity and air pressure comes back to aerodynamics as well, lower air pressure, the car can slip through the air easier, and humidity might have an effect on the battery. Battery preconditioning, whether you've done that or not, ideally you want to do that before you set off whilst you're connected to a charger of some description, and that will definitely have an effect on range. Then road factors. We've just talked about gradients, so really no need to go into those. Huge factor. Turns. Anytime you turn the steering wheel on a vehicle, you're using more energy than you were going straight ahead. And this is very well known in racing driver circles, because that's where we try and keep the steering wheel as straight as possible, just to try and shave off that last 100th of a second through a complex of corners. So turning increases. Traffic. Obviously, traffic will affect your consumption. You'll be stopping, starting, or not, as the case may be. Whether the surface is smooth. If you're on a coarse chip road, that will definitely use more energy as the vehicle bounces around a bit, and there's more rolling resistance and there's more noise. Where does that noise come from? Well, that noise is ultimately generated by energy from the battery. So you want a smooth surface, whether it's soft or not. So on a dirt road, it's softer than a tarmac road, and therefore your energy consumption will be increased as well. Your driving style, obviously speed plays a big part in that, as well as how you accelerate, how much you accelerate and how harshly you accelerate. That's a big factor. And weight, the heavier the vehicle, the more energy it's going to use. However, there's a rider to that, and that is when the vehicle is in steady state cruise, weight on a level ground, weight is not really much of a factor at all. Weight becomes a factor in two areas. One, when you're accelerating, and two, when you're going up a hill. That's when weight starts to tell. When you're in steady state cruise, weight's nearly irrelevant. What's important there is aerodynamic efficiency, and the higher speed you go, the more important aerodynamic efficiency is. The mode the car's in, eco mode, the car will typically shut off things and try and reduce the air conditioning, etc., etc. Sport mode, you'll get a quicker response, so the mode plays a difference. Feature use, there's pretty much anything you do in a car would require features. So if you're going to listen to Spotify, you're going to turn the aircon on, play with the sunroof, all of that's going to use energy as well. Tyre pressures, the higher the tyre pressure, the less the rolling resistance and the less energy used. Now, this doesn't mean to say drive everywhere at 55 psi, because that's likely to damage the tyre, increase risk of punctures, and compromise your safety and your handling. So use recommended pressures, but certainly don't let them drop. Tyre wear. A tyre which is significantly worn often has less rolling resistance than one which is brand new, tread depth, etc. So that's a factor. And you want to get precise about it, you can even talk about tyre diameter as well. And aerodynamics, again, we talked about, huge thing here. So if you're towing, because EVs are so aerodynamically sensitive, you put a trailer on the back, that makes a massive difference, let alone the weight. And I've got a video where I go into this in a lot of detail. You add roof racks, that's going to be aerodynamic drag, so that will increase your consumption. Even putting the windows down, that will increase drag as well. So some of the factors which go into creating range, and it is a prediction, it's a very complex algorithm, but it's getting better and better with artificial intelligence and external data sources feeding the car. And hopefully at some point we won't need to worry about it, because range will just be so great, we just won't become a factor. Now let's talk about the WLTP, which you've probably seen a lot of when you are looking for a new electric vehicle. That is the Worldwide Harmonised Light Vehicle Test Procedure, and it is a standard means of comparing vehicles' energy consumption, not just EVs but ICE as well. So why does it exist? There's a few reasons. One, to allow people to do that comparison. I look at car A, car B, car C, how much energy does it consume? What is the range? And I've got a good standard measure for that now. It's also to do with corporate regulation as well. So the car companies all have emission standards across their fleet, and they need to meet that. So pretty simple, you just test all of their cars, add up the emissions and say, is it more or less than the target? And there you go, you've got your compliance sorted. And there's also taxation. Many jurisdictions do have different tax regimes for different emissions of vehicles, and then you can use this as a standard. So it's a global standard in the EU. Energy consumption is from 2017 onwards, and replaced the old NED-C standard. So this is what it actually looks like. One of the cycles of the test is 30 minutes, 23.25 kilometres, 46.5 kilometres an hour average speed, and run at 23 degrees Celsius, and that's coming back to that temperature I talked about. There's 4 segments to it: a low speed, a medium speed, a high speed, and an extra high speed. And that goes up to 131 kilometres an hour. And this graph shows the speed of the car all the way from 0 to about 140, and that's over the 30-minute time period. All right, so a bit more detail on that then. So that there's actually an 800-page document, which I have read a bit of it, but not all of it. So this is where I got this from. The test is actually run twice. The battery is completely depleted, and that's how they know the usable capacity of the battery. They don't go for manufacturer specs. They charge it to 100% and keep going till it's depleted, and that gives them the overall battery capacity. And then if they know how much the consumption is, then the range can be calculated. Now, the car's put on what's called a dynamometer, which is like a rolling road, but that doesn't take into account aerodynamics. So to do that, factor that in, a coast down test is run where the car is driven at a certain speed, power is cut, and then you just see how long it takes to come to a halt, and then that will give you your aerodynamics and your rolling resistance as well, so that's added in. It does include charging losses. So let's say there's 1 unit of energy. By the time that gets into the car's battery, there's obviously a bit of a charging loss, so that's factored in as well. When you hear the term WLTP range, that's across all 4 cycles from low to extra high. When you hear WLTP city range, it's just the first 2 cycles as well. So if you're predominantly city user, then maybe you just look at WLTP city range if it's supplied by the manufacturer. Now you also need to be aware, and this is standard with cars since time immemorial, of the tricks, but particularly with EVs. The test done may not apply to your specific vehicle. So if you have, for example, a vehicle which has 19-inch diameter wheels and one which has 17-inch diameter wheels, the 17 will typically be lighter than the 19, and therefore you're going to get better fuel consumption out of the 17-inch tyres. Now I should stress that 17-inch wheels. I should stress that the overall tyre diameter will be the same in all cases. It's just the difference of how much that tyre is relative to the wheels. It's not actually changing tyre diameter, it's just wheel size relative to the tyre diameter.
So to summarise then, like for like, EVs will use more energy in hills and gradients. That is just a fact. However, range may appear to be better in hills for 3 reasons. 1, if you're doing a lot of prolonged regen coming down the hill, your range is going to look amazing because you just spent the last 20 k's, 5 k's, whatever, pumping energy into the battery, or at least not using very much. So you might get fooled into it by looking at your range calculator at the base of a hill. Secondly, you might well be doing slower speed in hills. If you're on the flat and you're doing 110 k's an hour and you come into a hilly section, you're only doing 40, 50, that might be enough to swing it in favour of the hilly section. I think, oh, hills are better. And finally, if you go further down and you go up, so you go up a bit and you go down the long way, well, yeah, your total energy is going to be very much in favour of the regen side of things, and therefore the range is going to look much better. Now remember, range estimates are really, really complex, and they do vary from vehicle to vehicle, as I've just shown there. There's a lot of machine learning going on there. I think a lot of privacy is going to need to be invaded to get exactly the information we need, and there'll be vehicle to vehicle stuff, and vehicles talking to sensors on roads and on traffic signs and other vehicles, and all of that will make range calculations much better. But it'll start to become a moot point anyway, because range will just become longer and longer, and we'll stop caring about range to the same extent, and also there'll be more and more charges. So this is kind of a temporary thing, I feel. And the best range will be always on flat roads, which are dead straight, no turning, at relatively lower speeds, not your 110 k's an hour, more like your 50 or 60 or thereabouts. Anything other than that and using features is going to use energy and therefore reduce range. So I hope you found this video useful. If you've got any questions or comments, please use the comment section, and thank you for watching.